What is the task that you dread the most in the shop? Is it sanding? For a lot of people, sanding is what they look forward to the least. But sanding is essential for most projects. So what exactly about sanding is so bad? For me, it's the mess it makes in my shop. In my shop, I have an old sander with no dust collection, and I typically do all the sanding on the workbench. Adding an air filter to the shop was one step towards reducing the dust, but that's not quite enough. So I'm going to make a dedicated sanding station that can help reduce the airborne dust in the shop. This is my solution to the sanding problem. It's a downdraft table with a cupboard to hold the vacuum, and some drawers for storage as well. I have a vacuum plugged into one of these so that I can turn it off and on with this remote. Later I plan to add some French cleats to the wall above the station so that I can store all the sanding essentials. I also added some of this shelf liner as a bit of padding so that whatever I'm sanding doesn't get marked up by the table. It also does a great job of preventing the material from sliding around while you're sanding. I'm starting with a fresh new sheet of plywood, and whenever I have a 4x8 sheet, I like to break it down into smaller pieces here on the workbench. These sheets of foam just keep the board up off the bench so I don't cut into the tabletop. I'll use the borer guide and the skill saw for these cuts. All of the cuts are done just about a ½ inch or so wider than they need to be, and later I'll cut them to exact measurements on the table saw. I've never been able to make precise cuts with the skill saw, so I rely on the table saw to get a more precise cut. The skill saw also makes a lot of splinters in this plywood. The top veneer on this plywood is extra thin, so it's tough to cut without splintering, and I'm sure my skill saw blade could either use a sharpening or a replacement. With my 4x8 sheet trimmed down to size, now I can move over to the table saw and get everything trimmed to the correct width. Whenever possible, I try to make sure that the factory edge is against the fence. That way, if I messed up with the skill saw, I can maybe fix it with the table saw. I'm not quite done with the skill saw yet though. These pieces are cut to width now, but they still need to be cut to length, and they're too long for the table saw. So I use the borer guide again, and this time the cut can't be fixed with the table saw, so I do my best to make it the exact length that I need. That's most of the cabinet box all cut out now. Now I just need to cut a strip that goes along the front. For the top of the downdraft table, I'm going to use some pegboard that I already have in the wood cart. This stuff is a little thicker than your average pegboard. Hopefully it'll be strong enough and won't sag. This piece was just a little longer than I wanted it to be, so I trimmed it to length, but the width was already fine. If I make this part too large, then the table won't be as effective. A smaller opening creates a better vacuum than the larger one. And I'm only using a small shop vac for this. This piece of pegboard needs a place to live though, and for that I'm going to cut out the inside of the top piece. Fair warning for everyone watching, some consider this an advanced technique with the skill saw, so please don't attempt it if you're not comfortable with it. I think that with the track in place as a guide, I'm confident with this type of cut. An alternative to the plunge cut is to drill a starter hole and then use the jigsaw to make this cut. But for me the jigsaw cut would never be as straight. I wanted the pegboard to be a tight fit, if possible. The plunge cut doesn't remove all the material, since the saw blade is round, so I'm left with a little bit of material to remove with the Japanese pull saw. Since the pull saw is thinner than the skill saw blade, I try to make sure that the pull saw is flush with the outside of the cut. That way the little chunk left over will end up on the waste side and not in the way of the pegboard. Now that I have the center all cut out, I'm going to build a little framework around it to create a sealed chamber to attach the vacuum to. The chamber will need to be airtight or the downdraft table won't work very well. I'm going to use 2x4 scraps for this part, but there is a problem. The edges of 2x4s have been sanded and are slightly rounded. Making this part with rounded lumber will make it much more difficult to seal. To make sealing it a little easier, I'm going to plane down the 2x4s a bit, so that they have nice clean corners to work with. Now I just need to cut these all to the correct lengths, and for that, it's back over to the crosscut sled. Now I can line it up in the hole with the tabletop and make sure it all fits, and everything looks good, so I can clamp it together. And then add some screws. This framework is going to be attached to the tabletop from underneath with some pocket holes. This seemed like the best way for me, since I don't want exposed screws visible on the top. At this point, the hole in the top of the table is the same size as the pegboard, and if I placed it in there now, it would just fall through. So I'm going to add some strips of wood around the inside of the hole, so the pegboard will sit flush with the top of the table. And it fits beautifully. Though I did plane down the 2x4s so the edges were nice and square, I wouldn't expect this to be airtight with that alone. There are plenty of gaps for air to pass through. So I'm going to add some caulking to any spot I can find where I think the air might be able to get through. When everything was dry, I got an old piece of the scrap paneling that I used on the shop walls. This is going to sit inside at an angle, and it'll have the hole cut in it for the vacuum to attach to. But first I'm going to cut it to width on the table saw, and then use the crosscut sled to cut it to length. To keep this part in place, I'll cut some more bits of scrap plywood and attach it to the bottom of the vacuum chamber. This will stop the panel from dropping out the bottom. And of course, to keep it all airtight, I'll add some more caulking to the seams. That pretty much completes the vacuum chamber, so now I'm almost ready to assemble the cabinet. I just need to cut out a couple of channels on the sides for the back panel. The sides were a little too large for the router table, so I swapped out the table saw blade for the dado stag and added a little sacrificial fence. And after testing the settings on some scraps, I cut the channel into the two back panels. The back panel is going to be cut from this 1/2-inch plywood. This is left over from the mobile lumber cart build. So once again I used the skill saw to cut this large piece. Now I have all my pieces cut for the main shell of the cabinet, and I can start making some pocket holes to hold it all together. And the back panel is going to be attached with these finishing nails that I found in my pile of random nails. And so I can finally get this off the workbench and onto the floor, I'll add the wheels to the bottom. Now that I have some space on the workbench, I can start working on the drawers. For that I started by cutting some 4-inch strips from a fresh sheet of plywood. These will be for the 3 middle drawers. When all the drawer pieces were cut to width, I cut them to length at the table saw. The drawers are pretty basic, no fancy joinery. I just used pocket screws to hold the boxes together. For the drawer bottoms, I had some material left over from the cabinets that I built a couple of months ago, but not enough to do all 6 drawers. But I do have some more of the wall panels left over, and between those two I'll have enough to do all the drawers. The panels are just getting glued to the boxes, with some brad nails to hold it all down while the glue dries. Once the glue was dry, I trimmed away any excess from the bottom panels to get them ready for the drawer slides. These aren't full extension drawer slides, but I already had a few of them sitting around, and they're much cheaper than the full extension ones. At this point the caulking was dry on the vacuum chamber, so I drilled out the hole for the vacuum hose, and attached the 3D printed parts to hold it all together. The top part is pretty much ready for now, but the bottom still needs some drawer faces and a cupboard door cut. Now that those are cut, I can install the drawers and attach the faces. Then drill some holes in the cupboard door. And add the hinges. The cabinet is built, but the space that it was made for is still full of other random stuff, so I need to get that all out of there first. And there it is, all done and in its new home. Now I can just plug the shop vac into the remote controlled outlet, put down some shelf liner, switch it on, and start sanding. This really doesn't make sanding any more fun, but it does a good job of pulling down a lot of the dust. The sanding station should help keep the shop a little cleaner, and it has the added bonus of a little extra storage space. Click here to see how I made the shop cabinets.